Well, good afternoon, everybody. As you see on the cover slide, it says that I'm talking to you, and it says special contributor Moira Nelson. I have to tell you, I was working on this program the other day, and my granddaughter came up and said, "What you doing, Pop-Pop?" And I said, "I'm working on a presentation for the Mariners Museum." She said, "What's it about?" And I said, "It's about the fastest ships to cross the Atlantic Ocean." She said, "Can I help?" And I said, "Oh, sweet pea, I don't think so." And about an hour later, she came back to me with a binder. I don't know if you can see this, but not that way. It says boats on the cover, and inside it's got a bunch of pictures. And she proceeded to give me a 10-minute briefing, which I felt I had to include a little bit of at the end of this presentation. So with that, let's see if we can, what am I doing? Now I've done it, help. I want this one, right? And this would help me better, I think. Okay. Aha, okay. So, Wisteria is hiding the mouse from me now. This program is entitled The 100-Year Race, The Quest for Speed in the North Atlantic Passenger Trade. It's about something called the Blue Riband, which was Riband with a D, which was supposedly the prize awarded to the fastest passenger ship in the North Atlantic trade. And as I begin, I should say it's actually the 110-year race, but that didn't sound good as a title. But let's launch ourselves into this. The Blue Riband, earned by the fastest passenger steamship in the North Atlantic. The most coveted prize, that never existed. There never was a Blue Ribbon. In the longest and most fairly contested race that was never organized, had no rules and no governing body. This begins to sound like it's kind of random, but in fact, it wasn't really random at all. There was an economic imperative. Obviously, customers were looking for the fastest ships, sometimes tempered by an interest in comfort and elegance, and safety was sometimes a consideration. But again, the competition among the steamship lines was very, very real and very intense. For the first 3/4 of a century, there was no prize at all. The only prize was the fact that the public recognized that a specific ship was the fastest in the trade. The concept of a blue riband or ribbon was introduced from horse racing around 1910 and became widely used, but in fact, there was no ribbon either. There was no actual prize until, as you see here, the HALES trophy in 1935. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And it had a blue ribbon as part of its decoration. But with that said, what are the rules for this? Well, again, there was no governing body, so the rules were just something that was generally agreed upon. And it was based on the average westbound transatlantic speed of passenger liners between somewhere in the British Isles and somewhere in New England or the Canadian Maritimes. Generally, it was, originally it was from dockside to dockside, but then they generally concluded that it would be better to do it from, I guess, what we call the sea buoy to the sea buoy, the distance during which they'd be able to operate at full speed. You see up here, up in the upper right corner, the British Isles, and on the upper left, we see the Canadian Maritimes and New England. And this is the general route that we're talking about. And this happens to be a chart that shows the proposed route of the Titanic and the actual route of the Carpathia, which came to a rescue. But that doesn't really pertain directly to what we're doing, so let's move on. There's no definitive list of who won it. The list of holders of the Blue Ribbon has largely been developed after the fact from whatever records were available. And there are kind of two lists, one for the westbound crossings and a second for the eastbound crossings. Now, the westbound crossings is the one that everybody really counts because that was the more difficult trip. The ships were traveling against the prevailing winds. They were traveling against the Gulf Stream. So that made a more challenging and meaningful determination of speed. And interestingly, the most consistent winner through these 110 years or so consistently said, there is no race. We are not racing. We are interested only in safety. And we'll come back to that a little bit. But in any case, let's get on with the race. In the early 19th century, when ships sailed from England or from New England across the ocean, there was no schedule. The ship basically waited until it had a full cargo, and until the master was satisfied that his crew was adequate and the weather conditions were right, and then they would sail. You might go and book passage on a ship that had 3/4 of its cargo loaded, thinking that it would leave soon. And you might sit for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 days or a week and watch other ships leave that managed to load their cargoes faster. In 1817, the Blackball line was established in New York to provide regularly scheduled transatlantic, what was called packet service. Regularly scheduled as in they would say, we're leaving next Thursday at 2 o'clock, and they would do that whether they were full or not. And this quickly became recognized as the way to get business and the way to run business. Packet service, the term packet applied to ships. The term packet, meaning a small package, referred to packets of important information or important items, and the ships that carried these things were generally fast, sturdy ships. The British Navy used packet ships as dispatch boats. So the term that was applied to important cargo became applied to these ships. Typically, the packet ships took 30 days eastbound and going against the current and the wind, about 45 to 75 days or longer. The packets, once they were established, averaged significantly less than that. In 1824, one packet, the New York, made the eastbound trip in much less than that. And 1833, Columbia made the westbound trip, the difficult one, in just 15 days and 23 hours. So these ships were good, seaworthy, efficient ships, but let me finish with sailing ships. You probably heard about the clipper ships. The clipper ships were the ultimate in fast sailing ships, built for the Asian trade between either Europe and Asia or America and Asia. They reached their prime in the 1860s. They were very fast, up to 16 knots. They were designed for long, long trips in which you couldn't possibly carry enough coal, at least in those days, to make it on steam power. But by this time, the North Atlantic steamship trade was well established, and so these ships were not really engaged in the transatlantic trade. So what was the first transatlantic steamship? Generally, people acknowledge the Savannah, which was built in New York. It crossed from Savannah, Georgia to Liverpool in 29.5 days in 1819. It was the first steamship or ship with steam power to make the transatlantic crossing, but they were only under steam actually for 3.5 days during that trip. So it's not really a steam trip across the ocean. The first crossing fully under steam belongs to the steamship Royal William. It was built for service between Halifax and Quebec, so it was built for service in the ocean water, although not necessarily the North Atlantic. In 1833, its owners decided that they were going to take the trip from Nova Scotia to London and sell it. And this being the first time a steamship was planning to make the trip all the way under steam, there was a lot of interest in it. And they did, in fact, complete that trip in 25 days under steam. Now, they're not considered the first holder of the Blue Riband because this is an eastbound trip, the easy one. So they don't really make the list. In the mid-1830s, a number of British companies were formed to provide transatlantic steamship service. The Great Western Steamship Company in 1835 built a very, very ahead of its time ship, the SS steamship Great Western, which was launched in July 1837. In 1836, another company, British and American Steam Navigation, commenced building what they said was going to be the largest and most splendid steamship ever. But it happened that Great Western was ready to sail before their ship, so they quickly chartered the steamship Sirius from the St. George Steam Packet Company. The Sirius was built for the coastal trade around the British Islands. So again, it was built for open water, but not really built for the North Atlantic. Well, the Sirius departed Queenstown in the British Isles on its way to New York City on April 3rd, 1838. They arrived in New York on the morning of April 23rd. That's 20 days later. Their average speed was 6.7 knots, and this being a westbound voyage, this is generally considered the first winner of the Blue Riband. they had some challenges. They didn't carry a lot of coal. They were running low on coal. The weather was bad. The master, who was actually a British naval officer, had to subdue a mutiny by the crew partway across. They were not very happy. And stories say they had to burn some of their spars. This is probably not true, but the master did say he burned about 4 barrels of pitch in order to conserve coal. He reportedly arrived in New York with about 15 tons of coal left in the bottom of his bunkers. Well, they arrived on the morning of April 23rd. On April 28th, yes, got that date wrong. They actually arrived on the 28th. And on April 28th, the Great Western arrived in New York a few hours after the Sirius, averaging 8.2 knots. They actually left 5 days later. But the bottom line is Sirius held the title of the first Blue Ribbon holder for probably about 6 hours. Great Western arrived. Great Western was, again, purpose-built for the trip across the Atlantic by a brilliant engineer by the name of, Isambard Kingdom Brunel. And we'll see a little more of him in a little bit. Meanwhile, enter Samuel Cunard. He was a Nova Scotia wealthy individual. He made his money originally in the lumber industry. He was the director of the Halifax Steamboat Company. He was part owner of the Royal William, which you will remember was the first to cross completely under steam. And in 1839, the British government decided to offer subsidies to commercial ship operators for the transatlantic mail to be carried by steamships. Cunard was very influential. He had friends in Parliament and wealthy business contacts. He used everything he had, and he got the mail contract for the transatlantic steamships. As a result, as it says here, he basically launched a company, a fleet, and an industry. He had 4 ships built in the next year. The Britannia class, they were built in 3 different shipyards on the Clyde River in Scotland. This is the flagship or the name ship, the Britannia, shown here. And Britannia, let's see, what do we have about that? Oh, okay, 219 feet long, 2-cycle side lever steam engines, 1,000 horsepower. It carried 115 passengers and about 250 tons of cargo. He was being practical in compromises between the passenger and the cargo. Something about Cunard we find is he was a very practical man throughout his career. Well, Cunard then proceeded to make a splash in the North Atlantic. They built a series of ships that were continually breaking the records for speed in that westward passage on the North Atlantic. Here we see the Columbia and the Great Western, and on the bottom, the Cambria, which held the record from 1845 to 1857. We're going considerably faster at this point. And it should be noted at this time that the records, while they were doing better and better, quite frequently they were managing to increase their speed through the auxiliary use of sails. They had kind of reached a limit on the speed they could get out of steam alone. And continues the America, the Europa, Asia. And we see continuing increases in speed. Now, if you look at this, these ships all look pretty much alike. As a matter of fact, Brunel's Great Western really set the standard. It was the prototype which everybody who is building paddle wheel steamships across the North Atlantic very closely followed until the end of paddle wheel steamships. Just as an aside, this man Brunel also designed the Great Eastern. This was not for the North Atlantic trade. If it had been, it would have probably precipitated changes much faster than they actually came. This was a massive ship launched in 1858, 692 feet long. That's more than 3 times longer than Cunard's first ships, more than twice as long as anything that was afloat at the time. 14 knots, hugely fast. That was its design speed, at least, designed to carry 4,000 passengers. You remember the ships that Cunard was building were carrying 100 and some. It also had a double hull, which proved very useful. In 1862, they ran up on Great Eastern Rock, named because they found it, and they put a hole in their hull, allegedly 10 times bigger than the hole in the Titanic. and the ship did not sink. It made it back into port under its own power, and reportedly most of the passengers never knew anything had happened. This was obviously an indication of an important safety feature, which was completely overlooked for the next 100 years. In fact, this ship was so far ahead of its time, a ship of its size was not, another one was not built for about 50 years. But this was for the Australian trade primarily. Sadly for Brunel and the ship's owners, in 1869, the Suez Canal opened and it couldn't handle a ship this big. So the smaller competitors were able to get to Australia much faster. And this ship was never really a financial success. Well, meanwhile, challengers to Cunard come up. The Collins Line, an American line, built the Pacific and the Baltic. Between the two of them, they held the records for a 6-year period for the speed. They were twice as large, not in length, but in total tonnage and volume as Cunard ships, and much more luxurious. But the Collins Line had some problems. They did not have the subsidy that Cunard had, so their costs were higher. And in 1854, the Arctic rammed a schooner in the fog and sank with a loss of 232 passengers. 2 years later, the paddle steamer Pacific disappeared in the North Atlantic with 240 passengers, never to be heard from again. This was not real good for their business. Meanwhile, Cunard is doing things right. You see in the upper left of this poster, for safety and comfort, take the old reliable Cunard line. They were here and continually stressing, we are safe. We are comfortable, we are fast, but above all else, we are safe. And they regained the Blue Riband, 1856 to 62, the Persia, and 1863 to 71, the Scotia. And let's see what we got on that. The Persia was the first iron-hulled record breaker in the North Atlantic service. And the Scotia was the final paddle wheel steamer. They knew at this point that paddle wheels were not the best propulsion for the North Atlantic, but they had a contract with the British government, which nobody had bothered to update, which said that they had to provide a certain number of paddle wheel steamers as troop transport in time of war. So this was built as a paddle wheel steamer to comply with that contract. Well, now a new star rises, specifically the White Star Line, and we see the Adriatic and the Germanic, which hold the title for about 4 years of the fastest steamer in the North Atlantic. And as you look at these, suddenly you notice, even between the Adriatic and the Germanic begins to look more like what we picture in our mind as an ocean liner. You see the more blunt bow, and you see the beginnings of a superstructure above the main deck. Now, you notice also that these end in IC. White Star Line ships tended to end in IC, like, oh, Titanic. And the Cunard lines ended in IA, like Britannia and like the, well, we'll see. And then other competitors are getting into the fray. Inman lines, which was originally established, as we'll see in a bit, for carrying the immigrant trade across the Atlantic, decided they were going to upgrade and go after some of this lucrative first-class trade. The city of Berlin, their ships were mostly named the City of, in 1875, makes the trip at an average of 15 knots. And then White Star comes back with Britannic and Germanic, coming in at 15.5 knots. And Britannic, by this time, we now have a ship which is 488 feet long, carrying 202 first-class passengers. And we've made a huge leap at this point, going from ships that were carrying 2 and 3 and sometimes 400 passengers. They're carrying now 200 first-class passengers and 1,500 in steerage. If you remember the movie Titanic, you know, the unfortunate folks were the ones traveling in steerage, which later got the more distinguished name of third class, but it was not the most comfortable way to travel. That was for the immigrants. Enter the Liverpool and Great Western Steamship Company, an awkward name, so it's generally called the Guyon Line after the man who founded it and provided the majority of the funding. It was founded in 1866, again, primarily to carry immigrants, and they also decided to go after the first-class traffic. In 1879, they launched the Arizona. It never was technically a Blue Riband holder, but they did set an eastbound record at almost 16 knots. And after about 2 voyages after their first voyage, they struck an iceberg. Sounds like a familiar story. Here you see the bow of the Arizona, and the bow was accordioned in about 25 feet in that collision, but the ship did not sink. It made it back to port under its own power because it was built with safety considerations and a very sturdy hull. Well, Guion then launched Alaska. We go from 15 knots to 17. Oregon, we go up to 18.5 knots. We're quickly gaining speed and we're gaining carrying capacity. See, the Oregon carry was 520 feet, carried 432 first-class passengers and 1,000 in steerage. Again, you see the compromise between the money in first class and the volume in steerage. But Guion had problems. One of their owners died. They had to liquidate some assets. They sold the Oregon back to her builders, and Cunard promptly purchased the ship. And a couple of years later, the Oregon struck a schooner on its transatlantic voyage just before coming into port in New York, hit a ship in a fog. It took it 8 hours to sink. 51 people were saved. One man decided to jump overboard. He was a professional cricket player from England. I don't know what that says, but he drowned. But basically everybody was saved. In this picture you see a pilot schooner that was the first on the scene that rescued a large number of people. So Cunard had this massive accident, but no one died other than one professional cricket player. And they then get back into the fray. Etruria, almost 19 knots. Umbria, over 19. Etruria again at 19 and a half. And let's see if I got any great wisdom to add on these. Etruria, they were the first steel-hulled transatlantic steamships to break records. Etruria was 519 feet long, so not the biggest ship built. She had 6 3-crank compound engines and carried 1,460 passengers. But again, there's always challengers. The Inman line, we mentioned them earlier. They had been founded in 1850, primarily for the immigrant trade. Their first ship was the city of Glasgow, shown here. And this was built for the express purpose of showing that people could have a profitable North Atlantic trade without government subsidies. In 1889 to 90, the city of Paris held the record. We're now up to over 20 knots. In 1892, the city of New York came in at almost 21 knots. But White Star, meanwhile, is still in the fight. They come back with Majestic and Teutonic at 20 knots in 1891. Majestic was 582 feet long, had 2 triple expansion engines. She was built with a subsidy as an auxiliary steam cruiser for the British Navy. And in fact, when she was launched in 1891, the day she was launched, she had on board mounted 8 4.7-inch guns. These were left on for a couple of weeks while they had a Royal Naval review, and then they were promptly removed for the passenger trade. But in any case, Cunard is now constantly updating, upgrading to try to keep at the forefront. Now, they have said they're not racing with anybody. Speed is not their primary consideration. Safety and comfort are. And they were indeed big on comforts. They were constantly setting the pace on elegance. But in fact, speed was still important. No matter how safe and comfortable you were, if you were slow and stodgy, you weren't going to get the business. We have the Lucania at almost 22 knots. And again, these are now looking very recognizably like transatlantic passenger steamships. We'll step in the Germans. Norddeutscher Lloyd, NDL, was founded in 1857, again, to get into the transatlantic trade, primarily carrying immigrants from Germany to America. But they decided that they were going to go for the first class trade. They built the Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse in 1898. Now we're coming in at 22 knots. And this was, let's see, 655 feet, 1,506 passengers. And And this was also built as an auxiliary steam cruiser. It served as an auxiliary steam cruiser for the German Navy in World War I. It sank several British ships before the British Navy finally caught up with it and sank it, so it did not survive the war. But meanwhile, NDL comes with the Deutschland, 23 knots, Kronprinz Wilhelm, and the Deutschland again. We're all hovering around 23 knots. Well, what's Cunard going to do about this? Well, they're going to build the Lusitania and the Mauretania. And the Lusitania and the Mauretania are 787 feet long. They carry almost 2,200 passengers. They've got 25 boilers, 4 steam turbines. We're seeing a new form of engine power now, and 4 screws for the first time. Massive propulsion systems. They were also the first ships to have elevators, electric lights, and wireless telegraph. Meanwhile, White Star Line has a significant setback. One of their ships hit an iceberg. Yeah, we know about that. The Titanic sank and 1,517 people died. The ship that came to their rescue, Titanic, IC, White Star, was rescued, the survivors, by Carpathia, IA, being Cunard Line. So they're interesting transaction of their long competition there. And meanwhile, Cunard builds bigger and better. In 1914, they launched the Aquitania. It never set a speed limit, although it was very close. It carried 901 feet, the biggest ship yet built, carried over 3,000 passengers, 21 double-ended boilers. Okay, we had 25 boilers on an earlier ship. This is only 21, except it's got a furnace on each end with people stoking coal in it. So it's effectively the equivalent of 42 boilers. Had a cruising speed of 23 knots, a maximum of 25. So it's right up there, close to the record setters. And we see their first class dining salon on the lower right. Elegance, elegance, elegance. Then Cunard has a problem. In May of 1915, the Lusitania was sunk by a German U-boat. Over almost 1,200 people died. You would think that this would be a dent in their safety record, but people didn't consider that. People considered it a inhuman act by the Germans. The Germans claimed that she was carrying war materials. The British firmly denied that and said this was just a horrible, horrible thing. By somewhere around 1983, the Germans finally admitted that while there were no tanks or airplanes aboard this ship, she did have a large cargo of ammunition, some of which, not specified, was extraordinarily volatile, probably meaning chemical munitions, and they were warning anyone interested in salvaging on this wreck to steer clear of it. So, well, meanwhile, with the Lusitania gone, the Mauretania carries the flag for Cunard, and for the next 20 years, with a speed of 26 knots, the Mauretania holds the Blue Riband. But that's not going to stop challengers. We have now Nordischer, I can't even remember it all of a sudden, NDL, the German line, comes in with the Bremen at almost 28 knots, and Europa. And these are 938 feet long, 4 sets of geared steam turbines. And now for the first time on major transatlantic steamships, we have oil fuel versus coal, which saves a lot of space, makes things cleaner, cuts down on the crew needed, a significant economy. And briefly, the Italians get into the act with Rex, which was largely considered one of the most elegant transatlantic steamships ever built. Here we see their grand stairway. And this was in service for a few years before the beginning of World War II. Meanwhile, in 1934, the Great Depression, Cunard and White Star are both having financial difficulties, and the British government is urging them to merge. Cunard was kind of resistant until the British government, which had given them a £3 million loan to build their new ship, Queen Mary, said, okay, if you will accept this merger, we will also give you a $5 million loan to build the follow-on ship, Queen Elizabeth. That was too much to resist. Cunard and White Star merged to form the Cunard White Star Limited. Cunard owned 62%, White Star owned 38%. And as we see, less than 15 years later, Cunard bought White Star out. They resumed operations as Cunard, and the name White Star then disappears from the North Atlantic competition completely. And of course, the French have to have a moment. So here we see the Normandy from 1935. Normandy is the most powerful steam turbine electric ship ever built. She's 972 feet long and carries 1,972 passengers, and over 30 knots is her speed. She set the record in 1935, briefly lost it in 36, and has it again in 37. Her ultimate fate at the beginning of World War II, she was impounded by the US in New York, and in 1942, they were in the process of converting her to a troop ship when a welder's torch set off a fire, and ultimately the fireboats pouring water into the ship poured enough in it that it rolled over on its side. And it wasn't until the end of the war that they were able at great expense to right the ship, and decided that putting it into service again would be even more to the extent of too expensive. But I'm a little ahead of myself. 1936, remember that little break in Normandy's record? Queen Mary was launched and set a new record of 30.14 knots. And then from 38 to 51, the Queen Mary held the Blue Riband with an unbeatable, so it seemed, record of almost 32 knots. That's a period of about 14 years. Here we see wartime service, the three biggest ships in the world at the time: Queen Elizabeth at the right, Queen Mary in the center, and Normandy at left. And this was before the Normandy obviously capsized, but the two British ships were covertly sent to the Americas for conversion into troop ships during the war. And in fact, in their wartime service, these two ships, basically the fastest ships in operation anywhere, were the only ships that sailed independently of convoys. They could actually sail 3 to 4 times faster than the average convoy. And so they would simply sail on their own, zigzag across the Atlantic, and outrun any U-boats that might encounter them. Well, the last word then is perhaps the SS United States. Built after the war in the United States, all of a sudden we have a quantum leap in speed, 35.5 knots. This is built right here in Newport News. And that was a record that set in 1952 has not been broken in 68 years. All righty, so gotta say, this ship is not quite what it used to be. This is a picture taken this year in Philadelphia. She holds the record, but there's no way she could repeat that performance. Through the years since she was decommissioned in 1969, up until which time she was running the North Atlantic passenger trade, through the years, she's been stripped of pretty much everything salvageable to raise money to preserve the ship. That's kind of ironic. At the Mariners Museum, we have quite a bit of furnishings and other things, mirrors from the Grand Salon. A lot of things were stripped to raise money, and what's left is a shell of a ship that, if they were able to restore it, would not really be much like the original anyway. Its fate is pretty much sealed. So what followed? Well, Brave New World. Cunard comes back with Queen Elizabeth II, which served in the North Atlantic trade from 1969 to 2008. It was the last regularly scheduled passenger liner in the North Atlantic trade, but not a record setter. Cunard finally goes out with a whimper. In 2005, Cunard was acquired by Carnival. But for 175 years, Cunard had been the leading steamship passenger liner operator on the North Atlantic Ocean. The Queen Elizabeth II was ultimately replaced by the Queen Mary II, which sadly, to show the total demise of Cunard, was not even British built. She was built in France. Just a little comparison then, we see the Titanic superimposed on a modern cruise liner. It's mind-boggling, I'll just say that. Oh, let's mention that HALES trophy now, because the Blue Riband, which everybody was seeking, never really existed. In 1934, a British shipping company owner, member of parliament, decided that a trophy was needed. He created the HALES trophy, 4 feet tall, incredible thing of gold and silver with a blue ribbon wrapped around it. And this was in fact awarded to the Italian liner Rex. It was awarded to the Normandy and ultimately to the United States. In between, Cunard refused to accept the trophy because they said, once again, we are not racing. Safety is our goal. To this day, this trophy is still awarded, but the rules have changed constantly, and no recipient since the United States has been a true scheduled North Atlantic passenger liner, and so its significance to this story is really kind of irrelevant. Well, now I told you my granddaughter wanted to help me, so she came to me the other night with a briefing, which she proceeded to give me. I think she had a little help from my wife. It's a little embarrassing to me that this particular thing comes from a website called 25 Boats That Can Outrun the Coast Guard. But in any case, yes, here's a boat that makes 317 miles an hour, which we see in the little fine print is only 275.98 knots. In other words, only about 240 knots faster than the fastest passenger ship ever to cross the North Atlantic. But of course, it's not a passenger ship. And kind of like the United States, it set a record that's been difficult to beat. So in summary, the Blue Riband for the fastest passenger ship on the North Atlantic, average speed westbound. It was first held by the Packet Columbia from the United States, held that record from 1830 to 1837. It was last held by the SS United States, which has held it for 68 years. And in the 114 years in between, I have to say this presentation was originally prepared for a Scottish heritage group. So here we go, Scotland rules. Scottish built ships held the title for 79 of the 114 years, over 2/3 of the time. And that's what we have for you. I will tell you here in the Mariners Museum, we have, you may have seen Ron Lewis's presentation on the Crabtree collection. There is a beautiful model there of Cunard's first ship, the Britannia. We also have a model, a builder's model of White Star's Britannic from about 30 years later, and a number of other things related to this story. So we hope we will see you when things are back to normal here in the Mariners Museum. Come on in and spend $1 and see the world. With that, we have questions. I'm open.
All right, Dan, we'll give people a moment to ask any questions. Go ahead and type that into the Q&A box, or if you wanted to ask it with your voice, go ahead and hit that raise your hand feature. So while people are coming up with something, I had a question. So you said regularly scheduled transatlantic. Are there any like passenger liners that even go across the Atlantic anymore?
Oh yes, there are cruise ships periodically either in off season from their tropical cruising or changes of home port or on their way to shipyard availabilities will schedule randomly transatlantic crossing. But of course, the modern cruise ships are built more than ever for comfort and elegance and much less for speed. You know, they're more concerned with a stable ride. So they're going to be probably 10 knots slower than, say, the United States.
Okay, great. So it looks like we've got one question here. It says, do you think there's any hope for saving the SS United States?
I'm not that deeply into what's been going on in that. There have been several groups through the years that have purchased and repurchased the ship with the hopes of saving it, turning it into, a couple of years ago, there was a thought floated that we could actually get it back in service afloat. I think that will never happen. If you ask me, at this point, the ship is so far deteriorated and it's been so much stripped of everything that makes it what it was. They'd have to completely reconstruct the interiors. As I understand it, significant parts of the machinery and the control stuff from the bridge has been removed. So as a matter of practicality, I doubt it.
Right. It's also my understanding that since it's such a narrow beam compared to a modern ship, that it probably wouldn't meet specific standards as far as like roll and yaw and stuff like that.
I don't know about standards, but certainly from the comfort point of view. I mean, those wide cruise ships with stabilizer systems built into them are built much more for stability than for speed. And even they, I mean, periodically you'll see YouTube videos taken on a cruise ship where furniture is rolling around on the deck if they hit some unusually bad weather. So yeah, it's a thing of its time, and I think its time has passed. Sadly, it's too bad that it wasn't seriously considered for preservation as a museum kind of thing much earlier, like 40 years ago.
Definitely. All right. Well, that looks like all the questions that we have.
Okay, well, it's been my pleasure, and I trust everyone who's watching, if anybody is still online, will have a wonderful and safe holiday season. And take care.
All right. Great. Thank you.